And please remember that this is a safe space. What we say here in this event should not be used for public knowledge. Lastly, I want to invite our political candidates to put their information in the chat. And thank you all again for being here to support North Shore Juneteenth Association. The funds contributed to this event will help us to continue our mission and expand the reach of our organization's message. And now my co-chair, Jodi Smith, will introduce our speaker. I would like to take a moment, though, to thank Jodi for leading the organization of this event. She has done an amazing job. So thank you very much, Jodi.
Thank you so much. My pleasure. Thank you, Nicole. And thanks to everyone joining us here today this afternoon. This year's Hats and Heels Tea could not have come together without the help from our committee and the community. I would like to take a moment to thank my co-chair and Juneteenth President, Nicole McClain, our committee, Adriana Paz and April Mosley, today's Zoom hostess, Wendy Joseph. I'd also like to thank Danica Thurston and the Lynn Museum, our official sponsors, Mass Humanities and the Lynn Cultural Council, the Cornell Club of Boston, the Marblehead Racial Justice Team, the Marblehead Task Force Against Discrimination, and for the beautiful music you heard earlier today, and we'll hear later on again today, the talented Marshonda Smith. A giant thank you to Sandy Shapiro and the countless others who sourced and donated today's teacups. And lastly, a thank you to Beth German, who spent hours wrapping each of the teacups and saucers for our goodie bags today. Now, it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce today's guest speaker. Dr. Carole Boyce Davies is the H.T. Rhodes Professor of Humane Letters and Professor of Africana Studies and English at Cornell University. She is the prize-winning author of Left of Karl Marx, Political Life of Black Communist Claudia Jones, along with many other books, hundreds of essays, and numerous articles published in major professional journals. Dr. Boyce Davies is a member of the Scientific Committee for UNESCO's updated General History of Africa, and her current research project is a manuscript entitled Alternative Presidents, Black Women and Political Leadership. Today, she will be speaking with us on Black women and the desire for a transformed USA. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Carole Boyce Davies.
Thank you for inviting me to the 4th annual virtual Hats and Heels Tea. I was saying earlier to Nicole that had I known, I would have ordered one of those amazing hats that I see Tiffany wearing as well, and Jennifer. So I said, you're going to have to send me one of those. I would rock that for sure. For sure. So it's a pleasure being here, and I see a lot of amazing, lovely people. So I will start, but I'm going to share my screen because I have some slides, and usually with Zoom lectures, it's useful to have some visuals. Otherwise it gets kind of tired, right? So let me do that now. I just have the basic info, of course, up there. Black women lead. And I use lead deliberately. Actually, I started a brief set of videos, podcasts that my students did, actually. We did videos as well. And they under the caption of Black Women Lead. So they're actually available at Cornell if you're ever interested in them. So anyway, so let me start then. I have two beginning quotes for my introduction. This one is coming from Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who was a poet, short story writer, activist, and from a piece she wrote called Woman's Political Future, 1893. She says, "I do not believe that the most ignorant and brutal man is better prepared to add value to the strength and durability of the government than the most cultured, upright, and intelligent woman. I know that no nation can gain its full measure of enlightenment and happiness if one half of it is free and the other half fettered." Right? So that's Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. And I love this quote because you can tell during the last presidency, it made a lot of sense to me what she was saying. but I'll leave that aside for now. And then Shirley Chisholm says, she has two books. One is that most people know about, Unbought and Unbossed, but she has a second book called The Good Fight, where she actually documents her run for president. Ironically, if you see that book, buy it, because now I gather one of my friends has it. Her mother left it for her. And when she went online to look, it was something like $700 for The Good Fight. So if you see The Good Fight, and in any kind of used bookstore, get it. But anyway, she says this: the mere fact that a Black woman dared to run for president seriously, not expecting to win, but sincerely trying to, is what it was all about. It can be done. And that's what I was trying to say by doing it. This is Shirley Chisholm, The Good Fight. And what we loved about Shirley Chisholm always was that her logic was that failing was actually winning, because in her time frame, to even dare to do what she did meant that she was actually already putting herself in the winning lane, if you will. Okay, so I'll leave that with you as kind of things to think about while you listen. And I'm seeing people having tea and stuff, so I'm really thinking, I should have at least a cocktail with me, but I have water, so I'll drink that. Anyway, so basically, my work assumes then Black women and political power. So my introduction is actually to my book titled Alternative Presidents, is titled Assuming Leadership, Black Women and Political Power. So Alternative Presidents then operates from the assumption that Black women have a right to political leadership. The assertion of Black women as alternative presidents then suggests for me that Black women have the capacity, capabilities, skill, knowledge to lead the contemporary as they have in the past. Additionally, we can assert that Black women can enact in their leadership alternative strategies to the given normative models of traditional male leadership. In this framing then, Black women are not secondary in the temporal sense, but synchronically alternative in that they can practice leadership differently, offer new models in the face of the combative models that manage our world today. The idea then is not that they are only alternative leaders in the place of men, but that they often enact different forms of leadership inside and outside of these official structures in local and global contexts. My central concerns in my study then were women participation in and out. And I want to stress this sort of inside-outside logic and have you see it as it runs through this entire discussion. So in and out then of official structures in the local and the global, therefore. My central concern then are women's participation in and out, as I said, but also of transformation of leadership paradigms, and also the ways that women navigate masculinist leadership constructs and therefore redefine or work to create new pro-women or pro-feminist leadership. I will explore these issues in my larger project through a study of some of the thoughts and practices of Black women on the continent, on the continent meaning on the African continent, but also in the African diaspora with specific reference to USA, Brazil, and the Caribbean. I'm looking then at women who have exercised or are planning to exercise leadership in a variety of spheres, but largely focusing on the political and the creative. So basically, I should say the book is in the publishers and it will be out hopefully by the end of this year. We'll see. As you know, all publications have their own dramas and trajectories, but it will be out. So I thank you for listening to me. So this is actually part of one of the chapters, the particular chapter that is looking at the US. So generally, political leadership is still seen as a masculine prerogative, corrupt practices or incompetence notwithstanding. Leadership in many countries is understood through a series of so-called founding fathers, a history then in which all women play an ancillary role or subordinate role, and sometimes no role at all, right? So whether it's Ghana, where you have Kwame Nkrumah gaining independence for Ghana in 1957, or Eric Williams in the Caribbean, what have you. You have the logic of founding fathers, and women are usually in those processes, but they never end up being in the leadership roles of those governments. Okay. For this reason, then, new and continuing questions have arisen about the nation itself as a masculine construct created for the benefit of male leaders. So, this masculinized notion of leadership, I want to assert, has a direct impact not only on the representation of women and women's issues, but also on normalized patterns of governance, including war and conquest. This view maintains the gendered nature of social organization in which men dominate. Assertions of women's leadership, then, as possibly being or informing transformative leadership, have contested the stereotypical equating of leadership only with masculinity. Also contesting these meanings are women deliberately assuming leadership in political and other institutional structures. The impact of women's leadership, then, and more specifically feminist leadership, in my view, challenges that normative model of charismatic leadership as the dominant or only model of political power. So you can tell I deliberately started with the three Black women who began the Black Lives Matter call for action, which has now become an international, probably larger, according to some estimations, than the last international Black movement, which was the Marcus Garvey UNIA. Okay, so according to Claudia Jones, who I've worked on, in her testimony to the court, she had made the statement, why are they so afraid of the views of one Black woman? And I want to use that as my trigger then to talk about Sojourner Truth, Maria Stewart, and so on. Maria Stewart, a lot of these people were in Boston. So Boston is really significant location for a lot of this discussion. Maria Stewart, 1803 to 1879, in the first public lecture of a Black woman on women's rights. This is where she uses the famous Daughters of Africa framing. She says, "O ye daughters of Africa, arise, awake, what have you done to immortalize your names beyond the grave?" Another call, right? Because she's charging them to come out from being unrecognized to actually being recognized. And then she says further, this is in Beverly Guy Sheftall's Words of Fire, "I'm of a strong opinion that the day on which we unite heart and soul and turn our attention to knowledge and improvement, that day the hissing and reproach among the nations of the earth against us will cease. And even those who now point at us with the finger of scorn will aid and befriend us. It is no use for us to sit with our hands folded, hanging our heads like bulrushes, lamenting our wretched condition, but let us make a mighty effort and arise, and if no one will promote or respect us, let us promote and respect ourselves." Look at that last line. Let us promote and respect ourselves, right? And this is Maria Stewart, 1803 to 1879, right? So the mobility of Harriet Tubman then, in and out of enslavement, and I say in and out because remember I said I want us to keep this inside-outside framing always. In and out of enslavement, or Sojourner Truth's purposeful walk out of a New York plantation, and their deliberate rearticulation of modes of resistance to enforced servitude provide practical models for which Black women leaders could use to challenge the boundaries of containment and then actually lead others to more liberated mental and physical places. In my understanding then, they provide the symbolic and historic resonances which help us to understand how Black women confront and negotiate systems of oppression in which they are still positioned in the United States and in other locations as well, right? So documentation that Black women voted at the 90th percentile in each election for candidates with more social justice leanings, 96 and 98% in 2008, 2012, and 2016, is not remarkable at all in this framing, but actually identifies a politics that, because of its location, has that angle of vision for the transformed USA political structures that they have consistently asserted. In many ways, then, the current rise of women to political leadership reflects decades of feminist, decolonial, and civil rights activism, which challenged the logic that leadership is only and always white or male. So while the United States, there were more Black male senators in the immediate post-emancipation period, it was not until after the Civil Rights Movement that we saw the steady rise of Black male and Black female leadership to political positions, but not without contestation, of course. Not surprisingly, then, the accomplishment of a first Black president in the United States, Obama, 2008 to 2016, was seen as the culmination of at least a century of activist work, which has been met still even now with mixed responses along a continuum of ranging from the extreme racism which followed in the Trump presidency and a series of nodal points of disappointment or satisfaction in the middle, right? And I like that quote at the end for Harriet Tubman. And this is my favorite photograph of her because it's her last photograph. And she was about 93 here. And the way she's staring back at the camera for me is just priceless. She said, I had reasoned out in my mind that there was one of two things I had a right to, liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other. So that's Harriet, of course. So my point is that we have already models of women moving in and out of containment, in and out of being restricted, finding ways to navigate pathways to get to more advanced placements of themselves and therefore leading. So in this, of course, she becomes a leader of the Underground Railroad, but also a general during the Civil War, where she led an armed expedition in the war and guided, liberated at least 700 enslaved Africans in South Carolina, right? And I found this is in Boston somewhere. I haven't seen this initial, this statue, but I found it so beautiful because it shows her in a kind of stately fashion with a cane, but also, like almost like here I am. I found it a beautiful representation. So Sojourner Truth in that famous Entire Woman speech. Because in that famous speech delivered in 1851, she's making an assertion about women's rights. Notice she says, I think that twixt the Negroes of the South and the women of the North all talking about rights, the white man will be in a fix pretty soon, right? And then she goes into that thing about herself being a woman, being clear about that representation. So Black women's leadership then encompasses their contributions to a range of disciplines and fields, often in the advancement of the creation and maintenance of the basics of human needs for food, clothing, and shelter, agricultural techniques and food production, and by extension, the culinary arts, textile production and fashion, modes of child rearing and family organization, herbal medicine and natural cures for common ailments, architecture and management of domestic structures. Many of these have enhanced or led to further scientific inventions which have aided human well-being. In the contemporary early 21st century period, Black women continue to demonstrate political and intellectual leadership to assert personal, social, and cultural autonomy, to challenge inequities and patriarchal oppression as they propel more advanced and equitable versions of the societies in which they live. The evidence is clear, as I said, that in the Black Lives Matter movement, now one of the largest international movements in history, was founded by three women, Opal Tometi, Patrisse Cullors, and Alicia Garza, as a call to action, but also the Me Too movement later on, providing critical levers for the well-being of women in general, but also Black people as well. So the fact that Black women have continuously exercised leadership in many different ways, I would begin by asserting, besides the Harriet Tubman and the Sojourner Truth, at the turn of the century, a constellation of Black women leaders who tend, although one thinks generally when one thinks of Black leadership at this time period, mostly of W.B. Du Bois, the question is that where are the women who were operating at that same time? And many of us have been filling in the blanks as far as that is concerned. We already saw Maria Stewart's point earlier from her first public lecture on the Daughters of Africa phrasing, right? But we also have her saying that she is of the belief that women eventually will find ways to assert themselves and attain leadership, right? So this is the rest of that Sojourner Truth statement. So this is Maria Stuart here, right? And as I said, 1803 to 1879, what if I'm a woman? You can see it's the same logic as ain't I a woman? What if I'm a woman? And a couple of things we want to know, that she uses the language of Africa. And when she talks about daughters of Africa, which was not unusual in that time frame as well. And then she also challenges men in this case to stand up and really exercise leadership, right? And she says further in the last one that basically we can move mountains against the prejudice that we have experienced, right? So this is Maria Stuart. First, she's identified as the first female political writer and abolitionist. But then there's another person who is often missing, and this is one that I've been spending a little bit of time thinking about, Anna Julia Cooper from Washington, D.C., who wrote a book called A Voice of the Sword from the South. She's actually one of the first people to radically put together something which would later on become defined as intersectionality. So she puts together this question of race and gender, right? Notice what she says here. She says, the colored woman of today occupies, one may say, a unique position in this country in a period itself transitional and unsettled. Her status seems one of the least ascertainable and definitive of all the forces which make for our civilization. She is confronted by both a woman question and a race problem, and it is as yet an unknown or an unacknowledged fact in both. So she's actually one of the first, according to scholars who have looked at her work, to put together this question of race and gender, which now, as we say, would be called an intersectional connection. Now, the other thing about her that is really significant is that she was actually in attendance in the first Pan-African Conference, which was held in London in 1900. But again, one hears about W.B. Du Bois being in that conference, but you don't realize that she was also in that conference. And I would say, given the fact that her book was written in 1892, it's my contention that this would have been one of the reasons why she was invited there to that conference, which was held in 1900, 8 years later, right? So Anna Julia Cooper then, in her classic articulation of an early intersectionality, has to be indicated as one of those women who were clearly beginning to give us the language that we would need to work. And because of this, is identified as an activist for both Black and women's rights. The leadership of Black women, we know, has tended to be the subject of historical erasure or neglect until we get to the founding of Black women's studies in the 1980s, again in Boston, and actually called the Combahee River Collective Statement, with people like Barbara Smith and so on being in the lead there. Barbara and Beverly Smith, her twin sister as well, as really significant there. So until we get to Black women's studies, there's no kind of sense that Black women are really actors or major actors, or that their histories were important. In fact, one tends to get a kind of chronology in which Black men tend to be the ones who get identified in all of those various movements. So until we get to the work of Black women historians and literary critics who found and studied the body of material that these women left, Black women intellectual and creative conditions tended to be unrecognized and unacknowledged. This is really highly illustrative, of course, in Ida B. Wells, 1862 to 1931. And my students love Ida B. Wells. One of them did a couple of them did a presentation on her on Thursday, because she did all of that work, anti-lynching and women's rights. She was also clear about being able to claim the fact that she is a woman married with children. And that was a source of contention by Susan B. Anthony, because she was such a powerful journalist. Susan B. Anthony told her that when she was about to get married, that she was disappointed. And Ida B. Wells was like, really? Why? And in Ida B. Wells' framing, she felt that she could do both, and she did do both. And she's really fascinated. Look at some of the things she did, right? According to Paula Giddings, who wrote her biography, she was probably the most uncompromising Black leader and maybe leader, period, that I've read about in this country. She never backed down from anything, even when other leaders did in various ways. Look at on the column on the right, all the things she did. She worked with Marcus Garvey. She ran for Congress in Chicago. She was a women's rights advocate. She worked with feminists for suffrage. She marched in suffrage with the suffragettes in DC in the front. And this is an interesting story because they really wanted her to go to the back of the line and march with the Black women. And what she did was wait. And when the march started, she marched in the front with the other white women suffragists. Recently, as you know, she received the posthumous Pulitzer Prize 2020 for her work on lynching. And she was a major person who documented that lynching had nothing to do with Black men's desire for white women, but that actually there was what she called an unwritten law, the Lynch Law in America. And this was, of course, evoked again when George Floyd was killed and so on. That is an unwritten law in which Black men could be killed by the dominant actors of white society, right? So her major research was on lynching and all of that, which now when we look back on it was an amazing, incredible amount of work. So this is the reference to the fact that she received the Pulitzer, right? But for one of the other things that really blows my mind is that when you think of the Garvey movement, Marcus Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association, one thinks of Garvey, the man, but the two wives of Garvey, both of them named Amy Ashwood and Amy Jakes, are really absolutely significant. So while Marcus Garvey has become synonymous with the leadership of the UNIA, mythologized in ceremonial form from photography to the lyrics and iconography of Rastafari, both of his wives were significant to the creation and advancement of this mission. One of them, the first wife, Amy Ashwood Garvey, and she's identified because she always started wearing kente cloth because when she was in England, she lived for a number of years in New York and then went to England. When she went to England, she met a number of students from Ghana, and she had been told a story from her grandmother about coming from Africa, from Ghana with certain names and so on. And when she asked the young students, they actually gave her those just documentation of where her family is from. She went to Ghana and actually found her family, and this is why she always wore kente after that. So she was actually one of the founders of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And then the second wife, Amy Jakes Garvey, was the one after Garvey was imprisoned who really held down the organization, ran it, and then further documented and published his writings, right? So basically, the question is that, as I'm suggesting here, is that the logic of the great man is the one that tends to be played unless we do the digging to find out who are the women involved in those processes. So one of my works, one of my products, and Jodi mentioned hearing me talk about this woman, and I always include her because she actually uses the language of half the world. And the language of half the world is suggesting that that women make up half the world's population. And all statistics give us 51%, 52%, and so on. So women make up half the world. And for Claudia Jones, half the world means that women need to be given at least their fair share of the world's resources. This is my cover of my book that I did on her, The Political Life of Black Communist Claudia Jones. And if you see the image on the left, this is Marx's bust, the bust of Karl Marx in Highgate Cemetery, London, which normally is, strewn with red roses and flowers all the time. And to the left of Marx's bust is a flat stone where Claudia Jones is interred. And this is where I got the title Left of Karl Marx from, right? So this framing then of activism and dedicated contribution in the face of neglect becomes then the paradox in which Black women continue to be located. And I need to look at the time. Oh, you set the speaker till 4:50, so I'll go on for another 10 minutes or so. And this is precisely what Shirley Chisholm similarly articulates in her own narrative of a political life, which she sought to contest deliberately and consistently in her own framing. And as I mentioned earlier, Shirley Chisholm has two books, Unbought and Unbossed and The Good Fight. one of the key assertions then that I wanted to make is that she is absolutely central to any assessment of Black women in politics in the United States. And for me, has become the sort of benchmark and guide for future women's advances to political leadership at the highest institutional levels. She often remains neglected as we pointed out earlier. And this tends to be one of the things that marks her. Interestingly, however, whenever there's a situation where women are running for office, Hillary Clinton or Kamala Harris, for example, there's a tendency to get quite a bit more activity around her name, and it calls for a statue for her to be at least placed in the Capitol and so on. But basically, for me, she provides the example for Black political women like Stacey Abrams, who, though clearly cheated out of the governorship of the Georgia, United States of Georgia, channeled the energy of that anger and agitation into what she called the Fair Fight campaign, which made then the same state, Georgia, shift to the Democratic Party in 2020 after being identified for years as a Republican stronghold. And of course, the Shirley Chisholm story, Congresswoman from New York. She ran from 1969 to 1983, becoming the first Black woman elected to Congress. And then, of course, in 1972, she makes history again by running as the first African American and the first woman to run for the US presidency on a Democratic ticket. Excuse me. I have to take this. Yeah. Pause, please. It's important. Chef, if you don't mind, I'm on a business call. Yeah.
Okay.
But you can come in.
No. I don't have the address.
Okay, I'll text it to you.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry about that, but I have somebody making a delivery and he was at the gate. He's gonna come. Thank you. Right. So basically, Shirley Chisholm's women rights activism becomes an additional component that we have to think about when we think of her, because generally we think of her as this sort of feisty woman who ran for office and so on, but she also had a major role in women's rights activism. She supported what was then called the ERA. She supported Angela Davis when Angela Davis was in trouble. She actually gave an address at the inaugural NBFO, the National Black Feminist Organization in New York City in 1973. So it's significant that Chisholm has to be seen, to me, in my view, as representing that combination that Anna Julia Cooper spoke about at the start, being a Black woman, but also carrying that question of the woman question and the Black woman question, but also, as you can see, the Sojourner Truth point that is made earlier, right? So she says, this is what she says in 1972, women are the majority of the population, but they are treated like a minority group. The prejudice against them is so widespread that paradoxically, most persons do not yet realize it exists. Indeed, most women do not realize it. They even accept being paid less for doing the same work as a man. They're as quick as any male to condemn a woman who ventures outside the limits of the role men have assigned to females, that of toy or drudge. And this is what she says in On Board and Unbossed, right? So her point is that women are the majority, as we said, generally 51% of the world's population, and it shifts from time to time and from depending on age group as well, but that essentially the prejudice is so intense that we assume that we should not run for office, or we assume that we should not have the power, or we assume that we're not going to win. And she wanted to definitely put herself out there to contest that, right? So she basically was actually calling forth new leadership. And what I found interesting about what she says here, and I just want to cite this point, where she says that basically in the future, there has to be new leaders found. She said they will not be found as much as they will be created by an electorate that has become ready to demand that it controls its own destiny. There must be a new coalition of all Americans, Black, white, red, yellow, and brown, rich and poor, who are no longer willing to allow their rights as human beings to be infringed upon by anyone or for any reason, right? So look at what she's asking for, a coalition then of Black, white, red, yellow, and brown, rich and poor, a broad spectrum then. This is what, of course, is going on now. And this is what we know has been one of the biggest problems that the US has had to encounter and still encountering, that it is in fact a multiracial nation, right? So for her, leadership has to be a new leadership, then has to be leadership that carries all of those uh, aspects, right? Right. So basically, the tendency is to see leadership in terms of charisma. Women's histories of civil rights have invented, however, new historiographies to discover important ways that women organized while men led. Messianic leadership has often erased women. Charisma, then, that logic of the one man, the messianic leader standing up and being able to speak and be publicly amazing and so on, tends to be one of the things that camouflages all of the work that women do, whether you're talking about the ministers in the church or in social organizations in general. So Black female leaders have often been written out of history or subjected to gender policing because of that, right? So I won't go into all of that. But basically then, by the time we get to 2000, we see still, according to Decima Williams, what she called a kind of global gendered apartheid, and which she says is a kind of undemocratic structure, particularly harsh for unschooled immigrant, non-white, non-elite women, which excludes most women from power and wealth and is found to one degree or another in every society. So this is what basically women around the world are struggling with. And this is what I wanted to say as it relates to the United States, that in spite of the fact the United States is a world leader, it still operates with pretty much a similar structure as many of the other countries have in practice. And in fact, some people think that some of the assertions, according to UN agencies, is that more than likely we'll get more movement from countries on the continent and around other parts of the world, in spite of the fact that it doesn't seem like it, because of the nature of their relationship to international agencies and international organizations like the UN and the signing, for example, of CEDAW, the Convention on the Discrimination, Elimination of Discrimination of all forms of discrimination against women, right? So we talked about these various women, not so? So that 20th century to early civil rights era, we have this major movement of women taking their place. We get to Rosa Parks in 1955 and 1956, where she, you know, according to everybody, it seems that she just decided to sit down, but she's actually exercising a particular form of leadership. But before her, there was other people like Claudia Calvin, who is still alive, who was 15 years old, did the same thing as well. So there were a series of movements of women who were challenging this logic of segregation and exercise leadership in various ways. And then, of course, we get to the 1970s. This is Angela Davis then and now, right? 2020, actually standing out and really challenging the ways in which racial oppression and gendered oppression operated to marginalize Black women, and actually suffering from it, paying the price, being incarcerated, but eventually being exonerated from any charge against her, right? And then political representation. Carole Mosley Braun in the United States Senate from 1993 to 1999, the first senator. Congress, there are 39 women now, 19 Black Congresswomen, 9 Latina, 7 Asian Pacific Islander, right? So this is my point is to really highlight, and I'm just going to go through, I know the time we're running out of, go through some of the key points I want to make in the rest of the slides. For Stacey Abrams, that one can also lead from the outside. So for her, leadership is a constant search for that distinction, she says, between when compromise is an act of power and when it is a concession. And she says she wants to leverage her anger. This is the same thing that Chisholm would say, as I said earlier, into fixing what she knows is broken, into showing others then the resilience that she can work with, and being able to engage, she says, from the outside. Leadership requires the ability to engage and to create empathy between communities with disparate needs and ideas. And that's why as outsiders, we can make the best and most effective leadership. And that's Stacey, of course. I love the fact that she found a way to take her knowledge and her skill and her leadership abilities and really go ahead and make it, like she said, a fair fight. Now think of Shirley Chisholm had said earlier, the good fight, right? So some of these languages repeat themselves. Remember the logic of the good trouble? Shirley Chisholm would say the good fight earlier than that statement. So by the time we get to Kamala Harris, the one African American woman senator, then until she becomes the vice presidential nominee and the vice president, once she left the Senate, there's no other Black woman senator. So the point is repeatedly that, again, the United States claims to be the most advanced, but how could you have a Senate where you have no Black woman really involved in that decision-making body, right? And then we get to our famous young people called the squad. Good leadership, then, according to Stacey Abrams, requires vision and aspiration. It requires the articulation of bold ideas that move people to action, but it is often the mastery of the seemingly unimportant details, the careful execution of tedious tasks, right? Our duty is to improve the human condition in every way we can. And then Shirley Chisholm in the good fight, we must turn away from the old line tired politicians to open our society to the energies and abilities of countless new groups of Americans, women, Blacks, Browns, Indians, Orientals, and youth, so that they can develop their own full potential and thereby participate equally enthusiastically in building a strong and just society, rich in its diversity and noble in its quality of life. For me, she actually calls into play the young women who are called the squad. So in 2019 in the US, we are finally at 23%, with a record 102 women serving in the incoming House of Representatives, comprising 23.4% of voting members, right? More than a third of those women won their seats for the first time. The midterms also sent 5 new women to the Senate, more than making up for the 2 female senators who lost their re-election bids. 25 women now serve in the US Senate. So around the world then, in conclusion, one sees a range of advances in women's leadership. So at the turn of the century, women held only 6% of seats in national cabinets and 13% of seats in world parliaments, right? But now, between 1995 and 2015, we saw approximately a 10% increase from 12 to 22%, 12 to 29 to 19%, 6 to 18%. According to the United Nations and Women's Role in Political Power globally, we're still operating, though, in the category of 17 to 22%, which includes most government levels, parliaments, heads of state, and so on. So for me, W.B. Du Bois actually called the 20th century the century of the color line, right? It was a legendary call he made at that first Pan-African conference in London in 1900. And it's an oft-repeated definition of the fact that race has remained a central concern throughout the 20th century and still continues a major issue into the 21st century. For me, though, and I want to claim the 21st century as a century of Black women's leadership. I posit, therefore, that the 21st century is one in which one will advance the role of women in creating a transformed and equitable world. Welcome Samia Hassan, who became the first woman president in Tanzania. Thank you, Virtual Hats and Heels. You're doing an amazing job. And I'm sending love and best wishes to all the people who are running for office. And I know one of them is one of your leaders, not so. So thank you so much.
We do have a couple of questions. I want to see if we can get as many questions as we can. The first is a real quick historical one. You mentioned that in I.W. Wells, she was talking about, in her book, about lynching. And someone had the question, were women also lynched as well as men? And can you comment on that briefly?
Absolutely. And that was one of the contributions she made to it. What she did really, because she was a journalist and used those skills, is actually go through the roles to see who was lynched, why they were lynched. And this is how she was able to document that women were also lynched. So the tendency, of course, and that was a great question, because the tendency is to see lynching as really only happening to men, but clearly women were also lynched. And there are images actually of women being lynched, photographs that, remember, they would share these photographs of lynching and circulate them. So there are images of that as well. But, relatedly, it's the same logic that one finds in the contemporary, where we know, the really graphic and horrible things that have been done to Black men. but we also know that Black women similarly have been abused by policing and by the state, right? So basically, that's the answer I'll give to that. For sure, it's definitely yes.
Thank you so much for that. I'm sorry to hear the answer, but I think
I
that
know.
it's good information
Really.
for people to have.
Mm-hmm.
The next question is, how can we channel our emotions and our anger into fixing what's broken?
Yeah, I would recommend Stacey Abrams' Lead from the Outside. My class used it, and it's actually a kind of manual. What she does in that book is have her, discussion in each chapter, but at the end of each chapter, she has like a checklist of things that you can do. And so it's like a manual as well. And I didn't go into talking about that, but I was quite pleased to see her do it like that. The Lead from the Outside book. It's a manual, and each section talks about how to get to study oneself. She talked, for example, about when she was about 15 or so, after having, probably a little bit older, but after having a kind of sad, flawed relationship with a boyfriend, which didn't work out, she spent the night sort of creating a chart of what she wanted her life to look like. And she found in a way that this was something really powerful to do, that one needs to actually stop and create a kind of systemic chart. And I've done that with young people as a kind of workshop, where you look at where you are located economically and where you want to be, where you're located educationally, where you want to be, relationship, personally, health wise, all of those things, and actually create a kind of chart and then look at it from time to time to see where you are in terms of achieving those things. So she recommends something similar. And I'm really pleased to recommend that work for your consideration.
Wonderful. I want to keep an eye on the time, so I'm going to combine the last question into two.
Mm-hmm.
The first part of the last question is, we enjoyed your book on Claudia Jones and wondered about your evaluation on the contributions of Ella Baker. And
oh, wow.
As you're commenting on Ella Baker, if you could end with the title of your upcoming book so that people know that.
Right. The title is called Alternative Presidents, plural, alternative. I should probably put it in the chat. Black Women's Right to Political Leadership. Yeah, and that's why I started by saying assuming women's leadership. And for me, the point that I want to stress, and that's why I ended with that statement about, revising Du Bois, bold enough to do that. Why not? But revising Du Bois to say this is going to be the century of Black women's leadership. It has to be. And we are right at the beginning of it. So if you have any of those aspirations, just go for it. Claudia Jones, Ella Baker was really a dynamic woman who is of the cut of the same kind of cloth as Claudia Jones. And why she's so significant, and Barbara Ransby has done a really nice book on Ella Baker, which I also recommend. What is really nice about Ella Baker is that she talks about a different kind of leadership. She defines a kind of collective leadership. She doesn't want this messianic leadership. And this is why she struggled both with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was run by mostly older Black men who were ministers and so on, and actually gave the space to SNCC, the student movement, so that they could come forward, they could rise. And this is why she's called the godmother of SNCC. So she has a similar kind of politics and activism as the Claudia Jones. They operated in the same time frame. I would love to know if they met. I'm sure they did, because they were operating in a similar frame. And different kind of political trajectories, of course, but doing similar kind of work. Now, Claudia Jones ends up going to London, and in London, she becomes like one of the most significantly important women people in terms of stabilizing the Caribbean community in London, which was just beginning to migrate there. So if you read Left of Karl Marx, you will find, and a lot of people love that book, and I'm happy about that it's becoming so well read, and it's such a classic now, that you will find that she really had a number of different variations on her life. So she's born in the Caribbean. She comes to the United States at 8, grows up in the US, joins the Communist Party, and then does all this activist work, and then eventually does it again when she goes to London. So I could give a whole other talk on Claudia Jones.
And in fact, if people have the opportunity, there's a podcast called What's Her Name? And Carole Boyce Davies is one of the fabulous presenters and presents about her book, Left of Karl Marx, on that podcast. And it's the What's Her Name podcast that brought me to Professor Boyce Davies. So that's the link all the way through. There's a number of questions, but I do want to at least close it out. Those of you who can stay to ask additional questions, we're happy to do that. But I wanted to officially thank Professor Boyce Davies for such an informational and educational and entertaining talk. We appreciate you taking the time to speak with us here today. I want to say thank you to our Black women tea owned shops. We have Ludmilla from Drink Our High G, that's this tea that you got, and Davina from Any Sips. These are both Black women tea shops that we're proud to support. The scones that you enjoyed were from David of Christopher's Cafe here in Lynn. He has the most amazing brunches and lunches, so if you haven't been there, you definitely should. He was really instrumental in supporting this tea, and we appreciate that. Juneteenth, the North Shore Juneteenth Association has a number of exciting events all year round. It's not just for the month of June. Juneteenth sponsors events all year round. And we have coming up next month flag raisings in a number of different communities here on the North Shore, and our Black Excellence 5K, which you can run or walk. We don't care, either one, as long as you're out and moving. Please visit our website for more information about these events and membership. There's a link in the chat to our organization. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. Thank you to Carole Boyce Davies. And I have a question, a favor. If you have your teacup nearby, if you have your hat and you've taken it off, hold it up so I can take a picture. Just smile and keep holding. We have more than one screen here. So I want to be able to take pictures. Hold those teacups up. And hold on, smile. I'm just changing to the next screen because we have multiple screens. Everybody smile. Wonderful. Thank you so much. I hope everyone is enjoying the things that were in their goodie bags. And for those of you who have to run off, we understand. It's been a pleasure having you here. We appreciate your support. And those of you, if Professor Boyce Davies can stay on for a minute or two, those of you who wanted to ask an additional question, hang out, hang in, and we'll be able to ask a couple more questions. Thank you.
And thank you everyone for coming. You look great in your hats. I love this. This was so much great information. Thank you, Dr. Boyce Davies. This was wonderful.
You too, yes.
Wonderful. So those of you who wanted to stay, please stay. Professor Boyce Davies, one of the questions that we asked is, what can we do for kids to access, kids in schools, our histories in our schools, to have access to these amazing African-American women who are really skipped in the history books that are in public schools today?
Right. Actually, somebody asked me that same question that you're asking me, and actually wanted to confirm if I would do a young adult, not even children, a young adult version of that Claudia Jones book. And I said, for sure I can do that. It's actually doable. There are a couple of books on Shirley Chisholm available. So one needs to just, go online and look for them. There are two books. I actually had two of them because I wanted to see what was available for children. And then I sent them to my granddaughter. So I don't have them to tell you what they are, but there are two of them available. So if you go on Amazon, I hate to recommend them. Ooh. Yeah, they've made so much money, that is. But if you search Shirley Chisholm books, you'll find. And what I could do, actually, is send you the names later on, if you don't mind.
If you send them to me, I'd be happy to send them out.
Yeah, right. And then there's one on Kamala Harris as well. I looked at that as well. So there's a company that is doing those, and they're creating those boxes where I actually sent a couple to my granddaughter. You could order the box and they send you the box with the name of the person, a book about them, and some activities around them, which you can also do.
Wonderful, thank you. The next question is, I wonder what Rosa Parks would think about where we are today.
I know.
Would be disappointed or surprised that we haven't made much progress?
You know, I think those hypothetical questions are always interesting. I think basically there would be there would be mixed, right? On the one hand, they can see what has happened and what kinds of gains we've had, but then on the other, they would be concerned. For example, one of my students was doing a presentation, and they found a quote where an interview actually that Shirley Chisholm did, where she said that. When they asked her if you think a Black woman will become president, and she said, yes, for sure, but she'll become vice president first. And I was like, this was just before Kamala Harris got nominated. So she actually had thought about this and kind of projected it. Can you imagine that? So you could actually go online and look for videos of Shirley Chisholm, and you hear her actually saying that she thought we would get to a president, but the person would more than likely be vice president first. Exactly what happened, right? Forethought, and foresight, I think, because these women, they were committed, they were activists, they were out there, they were not ashamed of losing. I think this is one of the things that women fear. And one of my students now, who actually works with the WTO new director, the Nigerian woman who became the new director, she did a presentation, and she's in economics, and she said basically men, they are found run for office or go for a position when they have 60% of the qualifications. For women, they think they can only run if they have 100% of the qualifications. Just think about that. And the same thing happens in classes, that you would find young white male students in particular, they're willing to hazard a guess if even they're not sure of the answer. And Black students, women would hardly step out and really try to use logic or whatever to come up with an answer. So you have to encourage women consistently to do that, to speak up, to get out there, to communicate, and so on.
I know that we have some of our youth leaders here in the call with us today that we're getting ready to ask a question. Professor Boyce Davies, these two young people fought for a full year here in Lynn to have a Black Lives Matter mural painted onto the street. And they just were finally able to sway the Lynn City Council for that to happen. And they wanted to be able to ask you a question directly. Damiani and Carlos to ask a quick question, and then we'll close out the group.
Mm-hmm. Hi, Doctor. So one of the questions.
Hi, guys. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
Mm-hmm.
One of the questions that I have, and I'm trying to find out how to best articulate it. But in your book, so you talk about how Claudia Jones is a communist. She says that, right?
She was a communist.
Mm-hmm. And then, but then so when we are still doing the Black Lives Matter mural, the biggest argument that comes from the weird people are like, Black Lives Matter is a bunch of communists, and I start to think about why they react in that way, and why Americans are so scared of communism.
Good question. Oh my God, brilliant question. That is such a great question. Basically, the U.S., I think, because you have a number of people who migrated from other places where they were trying to escape really horrendous dictatorships. Some of them probably see the United States or come to the United States. Cuba is a good example, as a place then that would allow them to have that sort of independent life, which does not have the kind of controls that they would identify a communist state as having. Now, keep in mind, there's no real communist country in the whole world. These are just ideological positions. Not even Cuba. Cuba is actually working towards a version. So there's no actual practicing communist country, not even Russia, not China, none of them. So basically, communism is an ideological position which talks about a different distribution of resources than does capitalism. The US is founded as a settler colonial nation, right? Which therefore means that it had to eliminate the indigenous people, right? Or send them off to live in really remote areas, genocide, took place across the Americas. The US was part of it. And therefore build a nation using forced labor of African peoples. So that's the basics. It's the fault line that runs right through the United States context. So holding up communism as a sort of straw man or as the boogeyman has become part of the definitive framing of American identity. And sadly, this is the case. And the reason why I say that is that if you are becoming naturalized in the United States and you have to go through the application process, there's a form you have to fill out. And 2 of those questions ask if you've ever been a member of the Communist Party. These are the same questions which were asked to the communists during the House On-American Activities trials, right? So in other words, my point is that the US frames itself as a country that is the opposite, complete opposite of any kind of communist framing. So therefore, anybody who comes with that assertion is identified then as sort of the opponent of that state. And therefore, it becomes like a disciplinary languaging in order to make people comply with this state dominant practice and policy. So it's kind of thrown out there at everybody. King was called a communist. Everybody was called a communist. Obama was called a socialist. So in other words, it becomes like the kind of scare quote or scare abuse that is thrown out to everybody so that you therefore operate in compliance with what the state wants its narrative to be. And that's how I see it, really. But people have pushed back against that and talk about these ideological positions that are talking about ways of having a more equitable society. So for Claudia Jones joining the Communist Party when she's 18 years old, studying all of the language and the ideologies that she was able to in that time frame, she saw the Communist Party as having the best interpretation for the questions of race as they were practiced in the United States in her time frame. And you would still have people coming through the years making similar assertions, even to the contemporary, where people talk about racial capitalism and how the context of race is still so intertwined with capitalistic processes, which keep certain people subordinated, consistently not able, therefore, to find ways to actually activate themselves fully in the society. So, I mean, it's quite an interesting kind of ongoing discussion, but I would not let it intimidate one. And I would say, people need to read, talk about these being ideologies and say that really this is just an ideological position, which according to Marx is eventually going to unfold anyway.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We thank you, Professor Carole Boyce Davies, for your time. You were fabulous. This has exceeded all of our expectations for a virtual event. So thank you for making.
Thank you for inviting me. And tell the students if they want to email me, they can for sure.
I will share your email with them. Wonderful.
Thank you very much. I'd love to talk with them.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye, Jodi. Thank you for your work.
Goodbye. Have a great evening. Those of you who want to stay on and say hi and show off your hats, feel free to do so. Thank you all for coming and being here and drinking tea and having scones with us. Please do be sure to visit the Juneteenth website. We would love to see you at our upcoming flag raisings and I don't think it's virtual this year, the real 5K. And thank you for your time. Wonderful.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.